I'm not really going to give a Dhammadesana. I'm just going to share with you some thoughts on some aspects of the Dhamma that I find don't seem to get a lot of coverage. You know, it was when I was 18 that I first started reading the Tipitaka. And since that time, there would be very few days when I haven't read it concerning something, looking up something, or I was writing something and I wanted a quotation or something like that. And so now, after coming on 50 years of being a monk, I think I know the Tipitaka fairly well. And it often surprises me that in an odd corner or at the end of a particular sutta, there's something that the Buddha says that is really very profound or very practical, which I hardly ever see mentioned in books or discussed in Dhammadesanas, very often. It seems that for most people at least, the Four Noble Truths, the Five Precepts, the Seven Factors of Enlightenment, the Satipatthana Sutta, the Metta Sutta, most people know these and other aspects of the Dhamma quite well, but beyond that, they seem to know very little indeed. And this always surprises me and saddens me. I think if people knew the Dhamma much better than they did, it would be very good for the sasana. Now, I think that there are good reasons why knowledge of the Dhamma beyond the usual small number of well-known aspects. First thing is, most people are very busy. They don't necessarily have time to delve into the Tipitaka. The second reason is the Tipitaka is really very big. Behind me, you will see I've got all the Tipitaka in Pali and up here in English. I mean, it's a pretty big book. It's a small library. The third reason is that if you want a copy in Sinhala, they're quite expensive. You can go to any hotel in Sri Lanka, open the drawer beside your bed, and you'll find a copy of the Bible. In the country where Buddhism has existed longer than anywhere else, you can go to a hotel and open the drawer and you'll never find a copy of the Dhammapada or the Sutta Nipata or something like that. It's interesting, isn't it? Interesting. Bible everywhere, Tipitaka nowhere. So I'm not sure why that is so, but I think it's a very unfortunate situation. Anyway, today what I'd like to just share some thoughts with you about is three aspects of the Dhamma which seem to me don't get discussed very often and which I think are probably quite important. And these three concepts or these ideas are mentioned frequently in the Tipitaka. They're mentioned often by the Buddha. And I think they need to be known and thought about and kept in mind often for anybody who's taken the Dhamma seriously. And this is the first one. Once the Buddha said that the Dhamma is, his Dhamma is Anupubba Sikha, Anupubba Kiriya, Anupubba Patipada. The Dhamma is a gradual training, a gradual doing, a gradual path. Anupubba Sikha, Anupubba Kiriya, Anupubba Patipada. Why do I think that's important? Well, probably because I'm a monk. I get to know people, I come into contact with people who take the Dhamma really seriously. And I find, particularly in the last maybe 10 or 20 years, one thing that has become really, there's been a revival of interest in, and that is the practice of meditation. And as a result, I find quite a lot of people are taking up meditation. They're becoming very serious about the practice, and they really want to spiritually progress. Is that a bad thing? No, definitely not. It's a very good sign. It's one healthy sign and I notice amongst Westerners, particularly young Westerners, you get exactly the same situation. A lot of people in the West take up Buddhism as sort of almost like a hobby or because it's fashionable. I wonder what the Buddha would think if he knew that his Dhamma has become fashionable. So this is a good thing, but I've noticed that it sometimes has got a negative side. And that is, I found people who they've got a job, they have a family, a spouse and a family, they're paying off their house, they've got bills to pay, and they are worried that they haven't attained enlightenment yet, or they haven't attained, they're not a Sotapanna yet, or a Sakadagami, or an Anagami, and they feel frustrated. Or sometimes they haven't attained those states, but they think they have. That's even worse. In other words, it seems to me that some people haven't understood that the Dhamma is a gradual training, a gradual doing, a gradual path. I meet people who they've become almost fanatical meditators. And they come to me and they tell me, Bhante, what stage have you got up to yet? I say, I haven't got up to any stages yet. And they say, well, how long will it take? And I said, well, it took the Buddha 6 years. And before that, it took him hundreds of lifetimes. It may take you that long. And then they feel, oh, and sometimes they burn themselves out. They become frustrated. They become burned out. They've extended too much energy. They become impatient. In other words, rather than developing a calm, accepting attitude, they've become almost greedy for the Dhamma. Now, this doesn't happen to everybody, of course, but I have noticed it. And even in the practice of Dhamma, of meditation, I found that people think that the longer they meditate, the better it is. So rather than just meditating for a particular period of time, say half an hour or something like that, they want to meditate for 1 hour. And after they can stand that, then they want to meditate for 2 hours, and they judge their success or their progress in the Dhamma by how many hours they can sit. So I try to remind people, it's not how long you sit. Ajahn Chah Ajahn Chah was once asked, how long should I sit for? And he said, I've seen chickens sit for hours. So it's not how long you sit, and nor is it how hard you try. That's not to say that making an effort and having a commitment isn't important. It is. But not by gritting your teeth and driving yourself forward. This is not the way. Why? Because the Dhamma is a gradual training, a gradual doing, a gradual path. My advice to people who are in this situation is always, first of all, I quote for them what the Buddha said. And then I suggest to them, rather than always looking behind you to see how far you've come, and always looking ahead of you to see how far you still have to go, that may not be the best attitude to bring to your practice. The best attitude to bring to your practice, I think, is to be mindful and aware, accepting of each situation, of each moment in your life. Be patient, be accepting, make an effort, but don't stress yourself. That's the first thing. The second thing I noticed that the Buddha repeats hundreds and hundreds of times is that the Dhamma is bahujan hitaya. The Dhamma is bahujan hitaya. Quite a few years ago, I was in India, in Bombay. And I was waiting for a bus. And a bus stopped in front of me, but it wasn't the bus that I wanted. But when it stopped in front of me, I read the sign on the side of the bus. And you'd be very surprised what it said. It said in Hindi letters, Bahujan Hitaya. I thought, isn't that wonderful? They have taken a phrase spoken by the Buddha and stuck it on their buses. So what does Bahujan Hitaya mean? It means for the welfare of the many. So apparently the Bombay government transport commission thought that that was a very nice saying, that their transport is for the benefit of everybody. So they put that on the side of their buses. Of course, the Dhamma is Bahujan Hitaya in a different sense. The Buddha's idea was that his Dhamma was not for a particular gender, certainly not for a particular race or caste or anything like that. It was for the welfare, the benefit, the good, the happiness of the many, meaning everybody, or if you like, the general public. Why is that important? Well, once again, sometimes I notice that people take up the Dhamma and they become very overly self-concerned. You might even say spiritually selfish. They become disinterested in the world around them, the people around them, various difficult situations that arise everywhere in the world, and they say that I'm not interested in that. I'm mainly interested in my own progress. You might even say they become sort of spiritually a bit selfish. This seems to be common in a lot of religions. And I think when I notice this amongst people, and they ask me about, how they can understand and practice the Dhamma better, if they seem to me to have fallen into this error, I always say that the Dhamma was Bahujan Hitaya. According to the Buddha, it was for the welfare and benefit of everybody. So if one is practicing the Dhamma, then it'll be for your welfare and benefit. But then I think it is also important, while focusing on yourself and being concerned about your own progress, that you don't forget that you're not alone in the world. There are others. So, for example, it may be that you don't know everything about the Dhamma, but you may know more than that guy there. So if you have the opportunity, what you know, share with him or her. You may notice that somebody is having difficulties in their life. And simply by reaching out and saying something kind to them or helping them in some way can just make their burden less heavy. In other words, Bahujan Hitaya, as it applies to the Dhamma, is being concerned about yourself and others. And in fact, there is a very interesting sutta where the Buddha says that there are 4 types of people in the world. There are those who are concerned about others, but not themselves. There are those who are concerned about themselves, but not others. And then there are those who are not concerned about themselves and not concerned about others. And there are those who are concerned about themselves and others too. And the Buddha said, of these 4 types of people, he or she, those who are concerned about themselves and others are the supreme, the highest, the topmost, and the best. I think that is a really lovely idea. Okay, we all know, at least we read in the paper, about people who are not concerned about themselves and not concerned about others. They just go through life making difficulties for themselves and making other people's lives a misery. Unfortunately, there's lots of people like that. Then you get people who are perhaps really good. They want to save the world. And they go around interfering in other people's lives, thinking that they're doing something for the benefit of others. And as a result of that, sometimes they become very egotistical. Then they start thinking, look, I know what's best for you. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to do this for you. Or why don't you do this? And then there are those who care about themselves, but don't care about others. This would be the type of person I was talking about a bit earlier, that they shut themselves off from the world. They're unconcerned about those around them, the situation around them. But according to the Buddha, those who take care of, who reach out to help, who are concerned about both themselves and others, such people are the supreme, the highest, the topmost, and the best. So I think that's something that anybody who's taking the Dhamma seriously should consider also. Bahujan Hitaya. The Dhamma is for the welfare of the many. And the third principle I'd like to talk about is one that I've seen, or I've seen often published in books. I've heard sermons about it and what have you. It's probably, of these 3 ideas, it's one that is fairly well known. Dukkhancha eva panya pemi, dukkhasacha nirudam. The Buddha said, in the past and now also, I teach Dhamma and the ending of Dhamma. I teach suffering, dukkha, and the ending of suffering. In the past and now also, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. Now, I have seen and heard this being interpreted as that's the only thing the Buddha talked about. That's the only thing that he mentioned. Well, that's a bit of a misunderstanding, because you only have to read the Tipitaka to know that the Buddha talked about lots and lots of things. He recommended that we do or avoid lots of different things. In fact, as you read through the Tipitaka, you have to be astonished at how many issues the Buddha addressed at one time or another in his 45 years of teaching. For example, in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha says there are 5 good reasons for cleaning your teeth. Well, maybe you could say that that's got something to do with Dhamma, because if you clean your teeth, you don't get toothaches, which are dukkha. But here is something very mundane, very prosaic, and very practical. The Buddha said, it's good to clean your teeth, keep your teeth clean. He says your breath smells nice. You enjoy your food more, etc. The Buddha talked about lots of different things. We all know the Sigalovada Sutta, where the Buddha talked about different relationships. So one of those relationships is, of course, friends. You know, there's parents and children and parents, and teachers and students, and bosses and workers, and friends. If you read in the Tipitaka, if you put the word mitta, friend, in the dictionary, you'll be surprised how frequently the Buddha talks about the importance of friendship. Of all of the relationships the Buddha talked about, he talked about friendship more than any other. And he talked about different types of friendship, different types of friends. Now, somebody might say, well, what on earth's that got to do with dukkha? Well, indirectly it does have. Because while we have to practice the Dhamma ourselves, we can't practice for somebody else, and they can't practice for us. So while the Dhamma is a do-it-yourself kit, it can't be done in isolation from others. Now, there are different reasons for this. One of them is, of course, that we as human beings are social animals. But also, one of the most important type of friends that the Buddha talked about, as you probably know, is the Kalyana Mitta, sometimes translated as the good friend or the spiritual friend. But as you probably know, Kalyana actually means beautiful, beautiful friend. Now, it doesn't mean a physically beautiful friend, although a Kalyana Mitra may be beautiful, physically beautiful, handsome or attractive. It means spiritually beautiful, one who has a beautiful heart, who cares about you, who's concerned for your welfare, who would do what he can or she can to encourage you to practice the Dhamma and follow the precepts, take up meditation. That person may know more than you about the Dhamma. You may know more about them. But that doesn't mean you know something that they don't know, and therefore you can share with them, or that they know something that you don't know, and they can share with you. In the Mahayana tradition, you might be interested to know that some aspects of Mahayana have been influenced by Hinduism. And in the Hindu tradition, you get this idea of the guru, that you can't progress along the path unless you have a guru. And you've got to commit yourself to that guru and have a great devotion to that guru, and that will help you move along the path. So that relationship between the shishya and the guru, the student and the teacher, this is sort of an unequal relationship. one's up here, he knows everything, and the other's down here, he's been instructed. But the Buddha, I don't know too many places where the Buddha talked about the importance and the necessity of having a teacher in a formal sense. But he very frequently talked about the importance of having a Kalyana Mitra, a beautiful friend. And the friendship relationship is one of equality, not formal. And that is an environment where that's a relationship in which people can learn more in a more comfortable manner than when there's somebody up there giving them instructions. Now, once again, somebody could say, well, what's that got to do with dukkha? The Buddha said that the only thing he teaches is suffering and the ending of suffering. Well, this is not directly related to that. Of course, if you think about it deeply enough, you can see the connection. So this is my idea, that the central focus and the purpose of the Dhamma is to identify dukkha and to do those things that the Buddha taught to overcome dukkha. And all of the other things the Buddha taught, discussed, recommended, or warned us against, all of those things in one way or another, even though they may not be directly related to the idea of dukkha, are there for a purpose. They're not here, but they are the platform on which we build up to get to there. So what some people do is they ignore or neglect all these, what we might call secondary teachings of Buddhism. So, for example, I hear this often, oh, Bhante, I'd like to practice the Dhamma, but I don't have time. I always say, really? Gee, that's funny. Now, why do they say that? They say that because they think practicing the Dhamma means meditating. And because they don't have time to meditate, they think that they don't have time to practice the Dhamma. Why? Because they think that only that is the Dhamma. And I always say to them, you don't have time to, where do you work? I work in the government office. I deal with the public all the time. You mean to tell me that you don't see any aspect of the Dhamma you can practice while you're dealing with the public? Speaking to people in a kindly and polite manner? Isn't that an aspect of practicing the Dhamma? Last time I looked, right speech was an aspect of practicing the Dhamma. Last time I looked, how you make your livelihood, samma ajiva, right livelihood, that's a practice of the Dhamma too. Well, what job do you do? Oh, I'm working in a shop. Really? So this is it. I find this is a very unfortunate thing. People think that only if you're practicing meditation or only if you're doing this, you're practicing the Dhamma. But all those other things, how can, in other words, in the process of living, there's hardly a single thing you do which cannot be in some way or another related to some aspect of something that the Buddha taught. So, dukkhancha eva panya pemi, dukkhasacha cha nirodham. Yes, absolutely, no doubt. The whole purpose of being of the Dhamma is to identify dukkha and to overcome it. But if you think by that that's the only thing that the Buddha taught, just that and absolutely nothing else, that might cause you to ignore all this other rich and vibrant and practical and profound things that the Buddha talked about, which should be seen as, and in a sense are, the platform from which you launch yourself upwards. So practicing the Dhamma means being a responsible citizen. Practicing the Dhamma means being a faithful spouse, a good parent, an honest business person, a diligent worker. Isn't that Dhamma? Yes, it absolutely is. It may not be as grand as going to Kanda border and spending a weekend meditating. It may not be as grand, but it is just as important. So these are three aspects of the Dhamma which I think is worth keeping in mind. That the Dhamma is Anupubba Sikha, Anupubba Kiriya, Anupubba Patipada, a gradual training, a gradual doing, a gradual path. And therefore we should walk that path and do that practice with patience. The Dhamma is Bahujan Hitaya. It is for the welfare of the many. And by that we mean if we are practicing the Dhamma and we are benefiting from it, we should reach out and in every way possible or in where it is appropriate, reach out to help others. And the Dhamma is all about, its central focus is suffering and the overcoming of suffering. But there are so many other aspects of the Dhamma that in one way or another relate to that and prepare us for understanding the problem of dukkha and overcoming it. Okay, that's really all that I can think of. There may be other aspects of the Dhamma that I have not covered here, but I think that these are three important ones, and I hope you'll consider them and keep them in mind as you go about your daily life.